and welcome to Finding Hope and Meaning Beyond COVID-19, part of a series of conversations for the National Day of Reflection. Well, during this panel discussion, we'll be talking about our future beyond the pandemic. We'll be exploring our relationships with grief, what sort of bereavement support we can give, and looking at our own mortality. Will we ever return to normal? Do we even want to? As some of us already beginning to experience re-entry syndrome and panicking. Yes. My name is Anneka Rice, and I'm thrilled to be hosting such an important discussion today. I'm joined by four brilliant guests: Julia Samuel, MBE, psychotherapist and author of Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass; Dr. Rachel Clarke, a palliative care expert and best-selling author of Dear Life, a doctor's story of love and loss; Steve Bland, campaigner and co-host of the award-winning podcast You, Me and the Big C; and GP Dr. Amir, best-selling author and resident medical expert on ITV's Good Morning Britain and Lorraine. Thank you so much for all being here. To start off, the pandemic has wrought an incredible strain on our NHS and healthcare system as a whole, not to mention the devastating impact on the well-being of nurses and doctors across the country. So I thought we'd start with Amir and Rachel, because you have been on the front line during this time, and I wondered what lessons should we learn and take forward. Amir, as a practicing GP, did you start off feeling like you were literally a rabbit caught in the headlights?
Yeah, Anneka, it was really challenging, certainly to begin with. You know, my role as a GP was about not only managing patients with COVID in the community, but also making sure people who had other illnesses were being well looked after as well. So it was a balance between the two. Initially, how we set up red hubs or red sites where we would see patients who weren't unwell enough to go to hospital, but were unwell enough to be seen, and they had a cough and a fever, that kind of thing, so potentially had COVID. At the time, we had no means to test them, so we were just going through clinical symptoms. And I'll be honest, Anneka, it was really scary from a personal point of view, you know, going into those clinics, issues around PPE, it was really, really scary. And we were hearing about our colleagues getting COVID, dying from COVID, particularly people from BAME communities as well. And that was really hard. And I remember my very first day at the Red Hub and driving in, and I was really, really nervous. And you know, I'll never really forget that feeling, because I've never been nervous about going into work before. It's always something I've generally looked forward to. So that was difficult. I got over it in time. You get used to things as you do. But the next thing really that was a challenge was we look after a number of nursing homes. We've got a large GP inner city practice, and we look after a number of nursing homes. And COVID hit our nursing homes really hard. And we were in and out of those nursing homes. Patients who weren't being sent to hospitals for various reasons were there. We had to look after them. We're again wearing PPE, which I'm sure Rachel will go into this in a bit more detail. But you have it's a barrier between you and the patient. Normally, when I'm looking after patients who are dying in the community, it's a very kind of personal relationship you have with them, and part of that involves things like holding their hand and talking and giving them, you know, just that kind of connection you have that PPE often stops you from having. The thing I found really challenging about this period really was talking to the relatives of people who had died from coronavirus, particularly in nursing homes. Like I said, we had a large number of people who did sadly pass away. And normally I would be having those conversations in person. At surgery, I would either visit them at home, or I would meet them at the nursing home, or they would come to the surgery. But because many of these people were elderly themselves and were shielding, we had to do it remotely, so either through video call, but many of them didn't have that technology. So it was just done over the phone. And that must have been, it's just not how we're taught to do it. It's not how we're trained to do it. It's not how we want to do it. And that was really tough for both parties. And I think that's had a lasting effect on a lot of these people who probably didn't get the same bereavement support that they would have done had it not been for COVID. I just want to touch very quickly on the point that that, during the pandemic, there were other illnesses going on as well. And we had to make a point of that. We saw, particularly in the first wave, and Steve, you may well mention this, but we saw patients presenting, not as frequently as they should have done or used to do for things like cancer symptoms. And we had to actively go out there and really promote the service and say, we do want to see you. And that was a worry. And we saw things like cervical screening numbers go down, childhood immunization numbers go down. All these really important services were impacted by COVID.
Can I just ask, did you feel at any point as the pandemic developed that being an NHS doctor actually made you a target once that wave of sort of collective for that philanthropy just dropped off slightly? Did you feel the public had your back or started to shift slightly?
I think initially they certainly had our back, and it felt like there was a lot of support for the NHS. I think the longer the pandemic went on for, the longer lockdown measures were in place or removed and then put back in, that's when the public started to lose. It's only a small proportion of people, I must say, but they were a very vocal bunch of people that felt that we were probably not doing things in the best interest of the general public by locking down, by prioritizing COVID services. And I can certainly understand it from a point of view from the other health services, the other health issues that are going on. The things, particularly patients who are on waiting lists for procedures that have, lengthened, and they're just left in pain, in anguish. And I'm talking to them every day as well. The thing that's changed everything, I guess, is the vaccination program. And that's been huge for us. Our practice is a vaccination hub. I've been, again, going out to nursing homes. I've been responsible for vaccinating our housebound patients. And that has been just fantastic. It's just the opposite of what happened at the start of the pandemic when I was going around to these people for different reasons, but now it just feels so much more positive, and I am feeling far more positive now than for a long time, really. So I do want to end on that high. The vaccination it's changing. The mood has definitely shifted, and that is important.
Dr. Rachel Clarke, you're a doctor specialising in palliative medicine, and Amir was talking there very movingly about going into nursing homes, and you've offered us such a tender meditation of how people confront their final days in your book, This Life. That came out just at the beginning of the pandemic, didn't it? Sort of February last year, I think, 2020. Do those stories still hold good?
Well, absolutely, Anneka. I mean, the essence of good palliative care is all about human connection. When someone's confronting the end of their life, interestingly, symptoms, things like pain, are often the easiest thing to fix. We have incredible drugs now, but there are some things that no amount of morphine can fix, and that is confronting the end of your life, knowing that everything and everyone that you love in this world is slipping through your grasp because you're dying. And for that, we know in palliative medicine that the really important thing, the thing that makes a difference, is other people. It is someone who is there, ideally someone you love, but actually, if not a member of your family or someone you love dearly, any human being can make the most incredible difference by being there and helping someone who's frightened at the end of their life know that they're not alone. And I think providing that has been the single greatest challenge in many ways through this pandemic, when you think about the ways in which COVID has just separated one human being from another. So PPE, the PPE that Amir mentions, has been so devastating. Trying to have a tender and humane conversation with a patient who's dying when you are barricaded behind a mask, a visor, a gown, gloves, and you know that the person you're in a room with has a disease that is killing them, that may infect you. All of that is incredibly difficult. And then I think the most heartbreaking thing of all has been the fact that we have not been able to allow visitors into hospital in the same way. And so many people have not been there at the bedside of their loved one in the final days, hours of their life. And I think for the population, that has meant grief has been incredibly complicated, because your instinct, your human instinct, when someone you love is dying, is to just rush in and be there and hold them and ensure they know that you love them. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things for me in the hospital was noticing that in the hospital car park, sometimes you would see cars in the empty car park with a person sitting just behind the steering wheel, staring at the hospital. And we realized that these were relatives and they couldn't physically go into the hospital. So they sat in the car park facing the hospital, longing to be there with the person they loved. And when I realized and understood what that meant, it was just a desperately painful vignette of all the ways in which this disease has been so cruel. But I think the flip side of that is, and I hope that this might reassure people listening, staff in the NHS and in care homes have done absolutely everything we can to provide that warm presence at the bedside, despite everything. And you can't imagine all the 1,001 ways that staff have gone the extra mile. We've held the hands of patients. We've read out final letters that family members have written to us and entrusted us with. We have played songs. We have ensured patients can have video calls with their loved ones. And as much as possible in every hospital up and down the country, we've tried to make sure that nobody has died alone. So if we have thought that someone is close to the end of life, we've always tried to make sure that someone has been sitting there with them, just loving them and making sure that they know they matter and they're a human being and they're cared for. And I think that is something that I take forwards as a real cause for hope, because the kindness and the determination and the courage of staff to stay humane and stay providing all of that care for patients has been completely mind-blowing. I saw that every single day in this pandemic, and it's wonderful. It's cause for real hope.
I think as a person not in the medical profession, what the most sort of shocking thing for me has been to see nurses and doctors at breaking point, because you just never see that. And we talked about your book that you wrote at the beginning of the pandemic, if you like, that came out. Obviously, you've just recently brought out another book which reflects on the past year, which is very desperate, and describes some of those things you've been discussing. How have you personally sort of kept your hope going? I mean, exhausting for you to try and give those people at the end of their lives that experience that your first book wrote so movingly about.
I think there's no way that there's nothing to be gained by pretending that this year has not been profoundly traumatic for everybody in one way or another. I think we're all united by one thing at the moment in Britain, and that thing is loss, because everybody has lost something through this pandemic, whether it is a loved one, or it is a job, or it is your children's complacent happiness because they used to run to school and not worry about catching COVID. Everybody has lost something. And I think that for me, certainly writing to begin with was almost an act of desperation. It was a way of coping with what I was seeing. I used to sit on my laptop in the kitchen late at night because I couldn't sleep, just trying to process everything that I was seeing. But I really do believe that in the most traumatic and darkest of times, that is when people have a choice. And what I've witnessed, not just inside the hospital, but outside in the country at large, is people making a choice to stand up and do the right thing and try their hardest to help in whatever tiny little way they can for others. So if I had a bad day and I had to pull over by the side of the road and cry before I came home to my family because I'd seen too many people dying from COVID that day, and that sometimes happened. When I got home and I heard my neighbours clapping and saying thank you, as they did on Thursday evenings, because they wanted to express gratitude for all of the porters and nurses and carers trying their hardest and doing the best they could, that was magnificent. And when I knew that my local street had set up a little WhatsApp group to help all the vulnerable people who couldn't get their shopping because they were shielding, that was human spirit in its most magnificent form. And that's real. That's not wishful thinking. That really happened all the way through the pandemic. So it's been the worst of times, but it's also reflected the best of human nature. And that's what I hold on to, because it's real, it's true. And I feel proud of how we've all done our best in these really difficult times. And that's what gives me hope moving on.
I'd like to bring in Julia at this point, Julia Samuel, psychotherapist and author of Grief Works and This Too Shall Pass. And that's very moving, what Rachel and Amir have just described. And as a therapist, counsellor, dying is at the end of the day a very lonely business, and bereavement, and there's a slight feeling of failure, isn't there, around sort of deaths at the moment, because it's a sort of COVID is a kind of medical failure. I don't know. Does that impact on your work and how people are dealing with dying at the moment and bereavement?
I mean, I think it was incredibly moving hearing what they both said, and I think the complexity of it is our fundamental powerlessness. The one thing that we fundamentally have no control over when medicine no longer works is death. Yeah. And what Rachel was saying and what Amir is saying is the thing that matters most when we're dying and when we think about the person we love is dying is the love and connection to others. That the best and most important medicine is love. Love is strong medicine. And the terrible thing about COVID was that social distancing and keeping away from each other made what was already very difficult and very complex much worse. And it definitely made many of the deaths traumatic, because the deaths were already sudden and out of the blue. Yeah. But then not being able to be with the people, not having that contact, the memory to be able to whisper, I love you, to hold their hand and go back and remember that after the death, means they're very likely to have complex grief. And all the people I've spoken to who had that experience where they watched, maybe partners of 40 years die over an iPad while they were shielding on their own in their home without their family members with them. That's what is wheeling around in their head. And that is very complicated. Not, all the rituals around grief, when we feel so powerless, out of control, give us a sense of order and it gives us connection. People bringing lasagna, coming in and hugging. The power of hugs to kind of viscerally calm your agitated, very hurting system, grieving system down is incredibly powerful. So I think it has made what was already bad much worse.
And has it left people sort of unable to fill this void or this feeling of what if? Because, COVID is something that's an extra thing that's dumped on us, apart from perhaps having other illnesses, cancer, or whatever, which we'll come to talk to with Steve about. There's a sense of, if only I hadn't done that, perhaps I wouldn't have caught it. There's so many other layers now.
You're absolutely right. This guilt and regret derail a kind of natural grieving process. All that terrible wheel of what ifs. If we'd gone to the doctor earlier, if we hadn't gone for a walk, if I hadn't gone to Sainsbury's, all the what ifs can sort of decimate you. But I think, as we're stepping out of the pandemic, what Rachel also talks about is growth, post-traumatic growth. So people have been traumatized and they will need proper clinical support. And I hope that those needs get met, because I don't think most of that level of loss can just be met on your own. It may be with some people, but a lot of people will need a lot of psychological support. But the community can make a big difference. But the big thing is that when people come through a very devastating experience, it never diminishes the level of the loss or how devastating it was. But some people are changed by it. And what they would say is that they're changed in a way where their perception of what matters in life, where their measure of their own resilience and robustness is changed, and the meaning that life gives them. And that feels like growth. And that, I think, where we can have hope.
And I think culture is very much imbued with this belief that we can fix something. We can always make it better, but especially now we just can't.
And I think one of the big messages for this is that we have to acknowledge the loss. We have to name it. We have to allow people the time to feel their pain and express their grief. And that always takes longer than anybody wants, both the people grieving and the people around them. Yeah. When one person dies, 8 to 9 significant people are grieving. So, that's 1 million people in this country who've been significantly bereaved, let alone as all the other losses that Rachel talked about. So we do need a kind of space and a time and an acknowledgement to allow ourselves to adjust to the devastation of these losses.
Yeah, I think you've said that hope is the alchemy that can turn a life around, and that is, I guess, your building block. You talk in your book about the 8 pillars, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Building blocks to recovery. Where would hope come in those building blocks?
I think we hold both. I think we have to name and acknowledge the loss and the pain and the experience of that and allow it. And I also, beside it, I think we have to allow and have hope. And hope isn't just a feeling, it's a kind of a direction that you're aimed at. And it's a plan and the belief that you can make it happen. And I think that will then can give you, even if it's just a tiny flicker of hope, that can give you sometimes that kind of incremental moment of energy to go for the walk that make you feel better, or to ring a friend, or to buy yourself some flowers. And in having that hope that will make you feel a bit better, then of course that's a positive cycle and you begin to feel better and then things begin to change. But it's normally an oscillation between the two where you feel the pain and you have moments where you feel better.
Can we bring Steve in at this point, Steve Bland, who is one of 3 members of a podcast, You, Me and the Big C. I'm talking of hope because you lost your wife, Rachel, to 2018.
Yeah.
And, hearing, what Julia says there, that must make a lot of sense to you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's all that we've got, isn't it? At the end is hope. And we talk about it with a lot of our guests on the podcast, a lot of people going through cancer. Deborah James, one of our presenters, she is going through bowel cancer and she's in her stage 4, and she always talks about the need for hope. It's as long as you have a treatment or a scan coming up or something you can cling on to, then that's kind of how you get day by day. Rachel was exactly the same, my wife Rachel, and that was exactly her outlook. And I think so many things that have come up have sort of rung true with me. I think the idea that human contact is absolutely essential was just something that was very much part of the way Rachel died, and I think that we did death fairly well. If you plan out how it might look, we did it quite well. And I think one of the heartbreaking things at the moment is that the way that we did it just isn't possible for so many people at the moment. And we had time to talk about what was going to happen, financially, logistically, that kind of thing, where Rachel wanted to die, what would happen to pensions, all of that kind of thing, what she wanted for our son Freddie. And then on top of that, we were able to have all our family around Rachel while she died, but also all our family around me after she died. And that was just so important. And I think it's heartbreaking, and I can't really quite imagine how it must feel to not have all those things around. And I think Julia talked about lasagna as well. Lasagna was a big part of my grieving process. The number of people that dropped round with a lasagna or a shepherd's pie was an absolute godsend. And to not be able to have that kind of, support around you must be so difficult at the moment.
I think you've talked about it. Certainly, your last podcast in 2020 was about positivity largely, wasn't it? And now you're almost saying to people, well, you've got cancer. Oops, you've got a bit of COVID too thrown as well.
It's so difficult. I mean, it's sort of been well documented, hasn't it, over the past few months, the impact on cancer services, and we've seen it on our podcast every week. We're not recording at the minute, but while we were recording at the end of last year, there was one very good friend of ours called Kelly, who was 31, and she came on the podcast about a week or so before she died, and it was just absolutely heartbreaking. She had bowel cancer, and it was stage 4, as it was, we should say, but her treatment had been put on hold due to COVID, and she died probably a little bit sooner than she would have been a little bit sooner than she would have done normally. And I think talking to her, she wasn't able to say goodbye to her friends, her family properly. It was all through a window. And I think it's the impact on cancer services has been quite devastating. And I think it's something that maybe we won't even see the half of it for a little while. As Amir talked about, the number of people going to see their GP is down. It's been creeping back up again, but at times it's been down by sort of 50-60% in some areas. And that's something that we're going to be counting the cost of for quite a long time to come.
In your podcast, You, Me and the Big C, how do you just let riff, or is there a real plan on how to balance the reality and perhaps feeling positive, hope?
I mean, I think that Lauren, Deborah, and I, we're all fairly naturally positive people, and we've got a lot to be thankful for. I mean, Lauren is coming out of her breast cancer now. It's sort of hopefully in the rearview mirror. Deborah, if anybody knows Deborah, she's relentlessly positive and upbeat and fairly nuts. And I think I've got a fairly pragmatic approach where I'm really good at focusing on the things that I can actually affect. And with cancer, and I guess to a degree with COVID, we've not been able to do anything. So, you sort of look at everything with that kind of lens that this is beyond our control. So what can we control? Well, we can choose to live in a positive way, and all those kind of cliches, make the best of each day and all that kind of thing, because that was really important to Rachel. And I know from my perspective, I'm the lucky one. She only reached 40, and I'm the one that gets to carry on living. I'm the one that gets to enjoy time with our son. So it's when you kind of think of things in that way, it's difficult not to be positive in a way.
Yeah, and your podcast in itself, is just such a lovely legacy, isn't it, for Rachel?
It's just
on her job. Yeah. I love that.
It's just amazing. It was something that was really important to her, and I mean, it was sort of set up as a bit of an experiment. Really, people weren't talking so much about cancer back then. If you look now on Instagram, you've got dozens and dozens of young people talking about their cancer experiences and how they kind of live with cancer. And I think back then in 2016, that just wasn't happening. So I think Lauren, Deborah, and Rachel, they were real trailblazers in that respect. And I think it's for me, it's been a massive focus to be able to continue something that was so important to her.
Yeah, I hope that as we're speaking now, we all feel vaguely that we might be going back to normal at some point. I know, Julia, you hate that phrase "new normal," so please no one mention that phrase. Why do you tell us why you don't like it?
I don't like it because I think it obfuscates our experience, which is that we are constantly changing, and I don't think there is a normal. So we know from all the research that people that don't adjust and recognize what has changed, both externally in their world and internally their response to it, that they do much less well. So I think we kind of create how we engage with the world by how we respond to it. And if we kind of doggedly
to pretend it's something new, in other words. So we've got to confront just now, the here and now, perhaps.
Yes, I think it's that we need to kind of recognize the things from the past that we want to hold on to, that we can take forward, and the things that we don't have any choice over, that we have to change and adjust to. So I think it's holding both. And that to look at that with sort of self-compassion towards the world. And I think one of the big things I hope will be coming out of this, hope being the operative word, is compassion between people, in communities, in society, in between systems. And I think that, I hope that has been expanded through COVID, and that would mean that people will suffer less.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of people, I guess their way of dealing with it will just be to sweep it under the rug and move on, and they'll be able to do that. For others, they'll have a completely different set of circumstances to navigate, and it'll be a very anxious time. How will you be offering hope to your patients?
I mean, I think that the psychological adjust to unlock is actually probably as big as it was to lock down.
Wow.
And everybody has their own default way of coping. And so you kind of have to recognize what kind of person you are, what circumstances you're in, and support yourself in it. So, if you're someone that is very extrovert, has a lot of energy, you want to go out and see lots of people, that's fantastic. But if you're someone who feels actually quite nervous now, have I lost my capacity to be able to talk to someone? Do I know how to sit in a bar with someone?
Yeah.
And just to go very slowly, kind of micro step by step. But the other thing I was kind of thinking is that I would invite people to reflect for themselves. What have they learned from the year? In some ways, it's wasted if they don't stop and kind of reflect, what are the things that really matter to me now? Because to me, it seems the kind of metric or the measures of success and power have got less, and that the much greater metric is well-being and connection and community, and that we need to kind of, if we want that to be a better world, we have to live that, how we live our lives and what we do with it. And I think we've seen that, like Rachel and Amir were talking about, the clapping for doctors, but all the, hundreds of thousands micro acts of kindness and compassion that really didn't probably exist before COVID. It would be so nice if we think we could expand them and have that grow in our life.
Rachel, I think you said on Twitter, human kindness finds a shape and form, however grim our prospects. As we try and move forward and go back to normal, what are you bringing to the conversation on that? How can you help those people, those elderly people that you're looking after, navigate this sort of strange new world of suddenly having so much human contact?
Well, I think if we think about the last year, that this pandemic year has been the year of death and dying, whether we have wanted it or liked it or not, death has been center stage. Every day we've had another death toll. The numbers dying has just dominated the news headlines. And I think one of the hardest challenges is to move on from that focus in a way. And it's tempting, as Julia says, to just close down and say, that's history. I don't want to think about it. It's been traumatic. I'm moving on. I'm ignoring that now. I just want to crack on with life in the future. And I think, in a way, what I think is helpful perhaps is to try and continue a public, national, communal conversation about precisely this thing that has been so traumatic, because usually death and dying is a taboo subject. There's a lot of fear and stigma around it. We don't like to talk about it. Well, for the last year, we've had no option. It's been center stage. It's dominated the public conversation. And it seems to me as though there's a real opportunity now as we move forwards to reflect, to think gently and thoughtfully and perhaps communally together about what we've learned that helps us go forward almost in our relationship with our mortality. So one thing that we've learned that's profoundly important is how very, very, very powerful human contact is at the end of life, of course, at any other point in life, boy, have we ever learned that that's a superpower. The sheer superpower of a hug, or holding a hand, or a simple conversation with someone who's vulnerable, those micro acts of kindness, as Julia puts it, they are immeasurably powerful, and they can carry through, that knowledge can carry through from this point onwards. And perhaps in the future, instead of wanting to shy away from death because it's too daunting a subject to think about, it's too frightening, perhaps we can hold our nerve and recognize what helps, which is human contact. Each other is what helps in dark and fearful times. So how do we hold on to each other as we move forwards? Because that has been the single most healing and powerful and important thing throughout the pandemic, and we need to hold on to it.
Amir, when you're, I was going to say when your surgery opens for business as normal, though obviously it is open at the moment, but I mean, there will be a lot of people who haven't come to see you because they're, for whatever reasons, they can't get in to see you. What are you expecting? What do you think is going to be your, the biggest challenge for you to deal with?
I think we're already seeing a lot of the after effects of COVID, or the long-term effects, not just the physical side of long COVID, which we deal with quite regularly, but the mental health side of things as well. People who have lost jobs, so the social effects that COVID has had, as well as the physical stuff. I just want to go back slightly and just talk about this idea of normal. I think we've got to get away from this idea of new normal, whether you like it or not. It's not going to go back to what it was. And as much as you might want to sweep it under the carpet, there are things beyond your control that will will be affected by COVID, that will then impact you. And my concern with this idea of a new normal, I guess, is where if there are lots of people who are desperate to return to normal, it might undermine the experiences of those people who have had that they've been traumatized by COVID, who've lost loved ones through COVID, who might want to talk about it but are afraid to do so because it reminds people of the past, things they don't want to be reminded of. And I think it's really important, certainly as a GP, I'm speaking to people who have lost loved ones during COVID, who are finding it really, really hard, and that will continue well beyond the pandemic. And as Rachel said, social contact is going to be key, and I imagine I'm going to be seeing that. We're all going to be seeing that for a long time to come.
Right. I'd love to ask each of you very briefly, as we come to the end of this, what is one thing you'd like to see going forward in your line of work? Should we start with you, Steve?
Can I have two things?
Oh, always
well,
one.
No, it's very quick. It's very quick. Two things, because it's a couple of things. One thing that Rachel mentioned about our relationship with death is really, really, really important, and it's something that maybe I hadn't considered until she mentioned it. But we're not good in this country, are we, about talking about death? And it's something that Rachel, my wife Rachel, was very, very, very good at. And for me, it helped massively, when it came to dealing with the actual process of death, but also dealing with after she died as well. And I think if this year of talking about death does make us a little bit more okay about talking about it, and that's not just the emotional side, but the admin side as well, all the things you have to do. Rachel used to call it her death admin, when she'd sit in bed and trying to figure out her pensions and all that kind of thing. But it was all to make sure that after she died, we were going to be okay. And it's that kind of, a lot of those conversations people don't want to have. And I think, Rachel's mum won't mind me saying that her husband died. Rachel's dad died of cancer a few years before Rachel, and they'd never talked about whether he wanted to be cremated or buried, for example. It just hadn't come up in those conversations. Rachel was determined, that shouldn't be the case. So I think if it could make us, a bit more okay with talking about death, that would be a real positive. And the other thing is, something Julia touched on, just our appreciation for life and that kind of thing. I was chatting to someone the other day about, why does it take an awful trauma like losing someone close to you to actually make us realize how precious our life is? And I think, now we've kind of all been through this year-long collective trauma. With a bit of luck, we all might come out of it a little bit more appreciative of what we've got, and a bit less likely to take all the blessings that we have for granted.
Thank you, Steve. You definitely allowed both of those.
Thank you.
And you've probably sort of said what we all want to say. But Amir, can you add to that, or has Steve just put a line on?
Steve has articulated what I was going to say really well, but I would just add one thing, which is slightly left field, is I would like people to kind of review our relationship with nature a little bit. Anyone who knows me will know I'm passionate about nature and wildlife. And during this pandemic, one of the things we've connected with has been nature, because that's the thing we're allowed to be outside and in and amongst. But also, the way the pandemic started, how we look after nature, how we treat nature, and I think that will have positive well-being effects for us, in the long term. So I would just add that very slightly different sentiment.
That's lovely, Rachel.
Well, in palliative medicine, there's one quote that I carry around with me at work, and it's beautiful. It's Saul Bellow, the American writer, who in one of his novels wrote that death is the dark backing a mirror needs if we are to see anything. And I love that quote, and I think it applies so profoundly to the year we've just experienced. That the death has been so traumatic, but it has revealed things. It has shown us things that matter, that are important. And let's all try to hold on to these revelations, that what matters is not stuff, it's not power, it's not status, it is the people you love and the people that love you. And let's hold on to that and never ever allow all of the admin and annoyances of everyday life to cause us to forget that, because it matters.
That's lovely. Julia?
Mine is an African proverb, which is, if you want to run fast, go alone. If you want to run far, go together. So it's the same thing about strong medicine. Love is being strong medicine. Can I put one more aside thing in?
God, you and Steve, what are you like?
It's not really the final point I want to make, but it seems to me a really important one, which links to the stigma around death. But I think the stigma around mental health has been reduced during COVID, and that people are talking about mental health much more. But I think there is still a very big barrier of talking about your mental health and actually reaching to connect to services to get help. And I think people are reluctant to get help. And so my ask of people is to turn to themselves with self-compassion and awareness, and kind of recognize that if they need help, please ask for it. Maybe just from friends and family, but also from professionals if you need it.
I'm going to add one. I wasn't going to.
Okay.
But, hey, why not? Mine is a quote that was put on a paper bag that's hung in our kitchen on the grapevine for 40 years. And on the bag, it says, "Life is good when you're in it." And I got this bag after I went to see a production of Chicken Shed, which is an inclusive theatre company where you'll sit and watch on stage the most beautiful thing happening. You might have an autistic child, someone in a wheelchair, Down syndrome, being supported by able-bodied children and adults, and it just sums up what life should be about, which is love and community. So I would like to throw that in and perhaps say that, life is good when you're in it, and it's up to all of us to embrace people and get them to be in that life with us, which is about community, isn't it? Thank you all so much for that. It was absolutely gripping and interesting, and I can only wish you all the success in the world going forward this year, because it is going to be a very big year from now on, isn't it? Thank you, Julia Samuel, Dr. Rachel Clarke, Steve Bland, and Dr. Amir Khan. Thank you, everyone, so much. This has been part of a series of talks for the National Day of Reflection, a day to commemorate the first anniversary of lockdown, led by Marie Curie.